Hello team, welcome to our week 9 video, which is the first of a few parts where we will be focusing in on each area of the golf course, and today we'll be focusing on tees and fairways with respect to their cultural and chemical management so that we can grow a playable surface. Defining expectations for the tees and fairways is critical in agronomic planning. So the tee boxes are unique because they're the only area where the player determines his or her lie. So they can choose to play the ball off the surface of the tee box or tee their ball up, however they like. So from a management perspective, the tee box must have enough turf for the player to have these options. Because of the option of the player, tee boxes are typically the lowest priority fine turf areas. Fairways are a little bit different. Usually you can hear fairways described as firm and fast or lean and mean, where lean is kind of a way of indicating that there have been incremental inputs of water and fertilizer trying to prevent the development of a lush and soft surface, because these types of fairways will catch a player's ball, and players want to be rewarded for hitting the fairway with a bounce and some extra yardage from the ball rolling. Along the same lines, players want a playable lie in the fairway, so complete turf coverage is expected. This expectation puts an emphasis on divot recovery and disease prevention. Now that we have some management expectations in mind, one of the first questions you have to ask is what turf species will make up our fairways and tees. The species of choice in our region is creeping bentgrass. Creeping bentgrass tolerates low mowing, and its lateral stoloniferous growth habit benefits recovery and density, which are both very important for playability. Some other things you have to categorize the turf species with are, like I said, some management tolerances. Can it tolerate the height of cut you're looking to use? How does it respond to aerification? How does it respond to drought tolerance? How does it respond to traffic? And then moving towards the chemical side of your turf species, you want to identify some key pests for that turf. For example, with creeping bentgrass, the major fungal infections are going to come from dollar spot, take-all patch, pythium blight, brown patch, just to name a few. Insects, there are white grubs, caterpillars, which make up the Lepidoptera, armyworms, cutworms, sod webworms, bill bugs, hairy chinch bug, and I included the annual bluegrass weevil. Uh, we'll get into more detail when we talk about insecticides, and then different weed species that will invade a creeping bentgrass stand. These include Poa annua, Kalinga, clover, goosegrass, crabgrass. Typically, those two, goosegrass and crabgrass, are the result of heavily compacted areas. So cart traffic again comes into play. So for every turf species, there's going to be different challenges because it's going to have different tolerances, and there's going to be other diseases that are more virulent in that particular species. Let's jump into an example of a fairway and identify some potential areas that can compromise plant health. So if we look here, I've tried to illustrate first at point B we have traffic from a cart path entering the fairway and cart path exiting the fairway. Then you see we have some irrigation laterals with our sprinklers and their coverage. So we can see some potential issues with our irrigation coverage where we have some blind spots in the fairways. And also over on A, we have some slopes that look to be south facing and also opposite of a sprinkler head. So we might be seeing some increased drought stress in some of these south facing slopes. Then over here, we have some elevation changes where we could potentially have some surface drainage all moving to a similar place on the golf course, and this drainage looks to be heading towards a high traffic area, so that could be a problem for management. And then towards the middle of the fairway, we have the landing zone where we're going to have an increased volume of divots. So right here we've identified 5 potential management issues where plant health can potentially be compromised. We're going to now go into some cultural controls to remedy some of these situations. So we've identified some predisposing factors putting plant health at risk. Recall that chemical solutions are not a cure-all, and cultural controls are necessary to remedy the underlying issues that will lead to disease. So we identified point A, where we have a south-facing slope and the area is also opposite to a sprinkler. So the stresses associated with this area include increased solar radiation. The slopes are decreasing the efficiency of the sprinkler coverage, and these slopes are also subject to runoff. So the plant's going to experience drought stress, heat stress, and therefore become more susceptible to traffic stress and will be under increased disease pressure. So to remedy this situation, these are going to be areas that have to be hand watered fairly regularly to supplement irrigation. And also during periods of excessive heat, it would be wise to use traffic signs to divert carts away from these higher susceptible areas. At point B, we have cart path pinch points. These areas are subject to more compaction from a high volume of cart traffic. This results in poor root systems in the plant, which can lead to nutrient deficiency and drought stress because the roots are not able to bring the necessary things into the plant. Similarly, compacted soils don't drain, so when you get irrigation or rain, water will pool up in these areas, so whatever turf is left will be now existing in an anoxic condition, and that's not going to help plant health either. A solution would be to aerate. Again, timing becomes an issue with this. And another solution is to disperse traffic and vary the patterns coming off the cart paths. We'll go into a little more detail in a few minutes. At point C, we were seeing a valley between elevation changes with surface drainage converging. This can lead to saturated soils in this particular area. And again, anoxic conditions are not going to be beneficial to plant health. So a way to remedy this situation is to aerify and make sure that the area doesn't become compact and water can drain through the soil. And also we can install subsurface drainage. Again, both of these solutions are time dependent, whether or not you can do it around play or not. So at point D, we mentioned the landing zone. So there's a high concentration of divots and also high traffic around this area because this is where the majority of the players might be hitting their drives. Okay, so again, compaction can lead to a poor root system, poor drainage. Also, you have scarred turf that is under repair. So there's seedlings that are going to be more susceptible to traffic and disease. So we can solve this by filling divots with divot mix that has additives such as some starter fertilizer to boost recovery, and also again diverting traffic away from these higher stress areas. And then E just wraps up with some coverage gaps from the irrigation system, going to increase drought stress in these areas where hand watering will be needed to supplement. And this might also be, if this is a wide scale issue across multiple fairways, it might be time to consider irrigation renovation. Again, that's a massive project and timing will be a big issue with that. So let's go back to our example fairway real quick just to see how we can use traffic signs and subsurface drainage to solve a couple problems here. So we've identified our traffic pattern, people coming onto the landing zone and then exiting here. So we talked about how these south-facing slopes are going to be under more stress. So we'll have a cart sign that says no carts past this point. We'll keep them out of this hilly area. And also, since we want to have our drainage in this valley, we'll keep carts out of the area where the majority of the water is draining. And we're going to take the drainage water off the fairway away from the traffic pattern. So we wouldn't want the water to drain out this way across an area that's going to get run over maybe a couple hundred times a day. That just is not going to work out well for the turf, and it would make much more sense to install your herringbone drainage system here and have the water drain away from the direction of traffic. So just an example of how we can use cart signs to keep traffic out of the most susceptible areas of the golf course. Another example here of how we can use ropes and signage to reduce compaction along a cart path and the immediate fairway off the cart path. So we can start at position 1 where we're sending all the golfers off the front end of the cart path, so our ropes will divert them this way. When this position 1 begins to get beat up, we take our ropes and block off part of the cart path and start sending off a little earlier on the cart path, while this area over here in position 1 has time to heal. When position 2 gets a little bit beat up, we move back to position 3 and ultimately back to position 4, so that hopefully by the time position 4 begins to get beat up, we can move the ropes and the cart signs back up on the cart path and begin sending them out of position 1 again, and we keep this rotation going. And we can also add some core aerification to this cycle, and that would further help the recovery. So like I said, we can add some core aerification to our pinch point remedy. So once position A becomes beat up, we move the ropes back to position 2, and we can begin core aerating position A. Then as position B becomes beat up, we move it back to position 3, and we can core aerate position 2 while position 1 has some more time to recover. So the longer the cart path section is, the more distributed the traffic can become, the more opportunities you have to core aerify, and the longer the turf has to recover. Along the lines of recovery, divot repair is a major point of emphasis, and patch material is usually sand-based with an organic material component. At Laurel Creek, we use top dressing sand mixed with compost, and the mix can also include a starter fertilizer to jumpstart the area around the divot, and also some bentgrass seed to aid in recovery. Sometimes there's also included a chewings fescue, which is a nursery grass and a species that tolerates stress a little better and helps the bentgrass establish. And when it comes to divot repair, it's difficult to go out and fill every single divot on the golf course. So it's important to prioritize, and that comes from identifying the landing zones in the fairways where you have the highest concentration of divots, so you know where to apply the most amount of mix to do the most amount of good. From the tee box perspective, par threes are obviously going to have a lot more divoting than a par four or a par five, but there are also some par four tee boxes where players like to use a wedge, and they will typically take a divot more often on some par fours. So prioritizing your highest concentration areas is going to help your ability to recover those areas of turf. Fertility can become a predisposing factor to disease if it is mismanaged. It's recommended that higher nitrogen concentrations be applied in early spring before disease pressure intensifies. Applications during the season are then applied through a spoon feeding technique that delivers nitrogen at around 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. This technique prevents over-application and lush turf, it mitigates fertilizer runoff, and it also reduces the risk of exacerbating a disease that thrives on excess nitrogen. Another important thing to note about fertility is returned clippings reduce the need for supplemental fertilizer inputs. Clippings on tees are collected and removed. However, to remove clippings from fairways is time consuming, so the clippings are dispersed with a blower. This technique also has some implications in disease management. So I'm going to explain the chemical control of key fungal pests using the example of dollar spot. So from a textbook, you can find that some of the predisposing factors to dollar spot are extended leaf wetness, thatch accumulation, drought stress, low height of cut, and low nitrogen inputs. The three that I have bolded are items that would lead to a chemical solution because for extended leaf wetness, we do not cut fairways every day, nor do we have the time to remove dew from the fairways on a daily basis. So there are days where the environmental conditions might support disease and we can't reduce the wetness of the plant. Low height of cut also predisposes the turf to disease. However, to achieve our firm and fast conditions, we can't increase the height of cut. Therefore, that has to stay the same. Low nitrogen inputs. Remember, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, your higher concentrations of nitrogen are going down before disease pressure. So once disease pressure is occurring, you're doing spoon feeding applications. So we're not going to put our turf at risk of high nitrogen diseases to prevent only dollar spots. So our nitrogen input probably won't change during disease pressure as well. Moving on to these cultural controls that are recommended. So remove dew in the early morning, not something we can do every day. Remove clippings during active disease. Removing clippings from fairways is time consuming and an arduous process that we also might not have time for. So those clippings can contain the mycelium of active disease that blowing those clippings around the fairway can spread the disease. That's definitely informing a chemical control. Aerifying to reduce thatch and compaction. This is something that can only happen at certain points of the year. And then using resistant varieties of grass seed. So I have here the dollar spot ratings of bentgrass cultivars for dollar spot. All of the best cultivars of bentgrass, none of them have a resistance rating to dollar spot above a 7.2. We look down and you see Pencross bentgrass, which is primarily what's used at Laurel Creek. It has a 3.3. So we do not have a very resistant variety of bentgrass on our golf course. And that's not really a big deal because there isn't anything available on the market that has complete resistance. So at the end of the day, no matter what bentgrass seeds you buy, you might have one that gets dollar spot less intensely. However, you still have to control dollar spot because it is not close to resistant. All right. So these are some things that are pointing us towards chemical control, and we can't rely alone on cultural remedies. Once we determine that a chemical control is necessary for dollar spot, we have to scout the golf course and correctly identify dollar spot. So using weather data, we can apply the Smith-Kearns model. So the optimal temperature for dollar spot is 54 degrees Fahrenheit to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And then based on relative humidity, you can determine the risk for disease. So when you're scouting your weather data and you start to see these relative humidity numbers in conjunction with the ambient temperature, you know I got to start keeping an eye out for dollar spot. So when you go, you can get good descriptions of what dollar spot looks like in the field from various resources on the internet or in a textbook. Even if you're very confident that you're looking at the right thing, it never hurts to identify the active disease and confirm your suspicions by sending that to a diagnostic lab and then you know that your chemical solution should be targeted on the proper pest. So at this point, we have verified that we do in fact have dollar spot and that we need a chemical solution for our disease. So I recommend going to another form of research called the chemical control of turfgrass disease. You look up dollar spot in a table of contents, and it brings you to a table that has just about every active ingredient you can think of, as well as its frac code, its efficacy, and an application interval. So dollar spot is very capable of becoming resistant to active ingredients. So resistant management is very important. So some measures to prevent the development of resistance are to correctly identify the causal agent, which we have done by sending to a diagnostic lab. We're going to select an effective product, and we're going to do that by reading this document and paying attention to the efficacy column. We're also going to be rotating active ingredients. So whatever fungicide is, we're not going to just use one effective fungicide. We're going to rotate our active ingredients. We're also going to rotate the mode of action, which is by rotating your frac code, because the frac codes also indicate the mode of action of the particular active ingredient. Then we are going to use label-specific rates and application intervals, and we're going to supplement chemical control with cultural controls, which we've already talked about. So just to have an example for dollar spot, one of the most effective chemicals against dollar spot is chlorothalonil, which is the active ingredient in Daconil Action, which we use at Laurel Creek, as well as Previa. And we see that the efficacy is rated as a 3, and we can apply that at a 7 to 14 day interval. Okay, so we might start our treatment with Daconil. Then, if we still have persistent disease and we need to do another application, in that 7 to 14 days, it might be beneficial for us to cycle in something with a different frac code. So chlorothalonil has the frac code M5. Well, we also have an effective chemical with a different frac code 7, and that's penthopyrad, which is the active ingredient of Valista, and that has a application interval of 14 to 21 days. So in 2 successive applications targeting just dollar spot, we can apply 2 highly effective chemicals with different modes of actions that could hopefully control the disease and also prevent the development of resistance. Next week, when we begin discussing greens management, we will go into more detail with respect to the chemical control of insect pests. For fairways and tees, it's worth mentioning the annual bluegrass weevil, because if you look at the annual bluegrass weevil life cycle, we see this period of time in early spring and late fall where we have adults present. The adults migrate from higher cut turf areas and tree litter, and they travel through the fairways and tee boxes to the greens, particularly to get to the highest concentrations of Poa annua. Annual bluegrass weevil also can damage bentgrass, so it's a concern in the fairways, but not as big of a concern as in the greens. So the greens management of the annual bluegrass weevil is much more intense than that in the fairway. But what's important about the key insect of the fairways is that your treatments of the adult annual bluegrass weevils also target the life stages of other insect pests in the fairways and tees. So by treating the fairways for adult annual bluegrass weevils, you're also getting control of some less virulent insect pests, and that's kind of how your insecticide program works in the tees and fairways. When it comes to controlling weed infestations in the fairways and tees, the best control is low mowing. So there are very few weeds that can tolerate mowing at 1/8 of an inch, and this is going to be your most effective form of weed control. However, it's also important to have a pre-emergent program because the second best way to eliminate weeds from the tees and fairways is to not let them emerge in the first place. And this is achieved through a fall application of a pre-emergent herbicide, followed by a second spring application of a different pre-emergent herbicide. And this will hopefully lead to a situation where during the season, you only have to do spot treatments of post-emergent herbicides. And typically you'll see some clover outbreaks and also some POA annual outbreaks that will require some spot treatments of a post-emergent herbicide, and that is how you would control some weeds in your fairways and tee boxes. So for the first time this year, I have blown past the 20-minute threshold that I had put on these videos, but there's a lot of things going on, and I hope you all have a better understanding of how our cultural, chemical programs all come together in our efforts to produce a superior playing surface. So that will be it for this week. Let's have a great one.